Okay, so welcome to the first History on the Edge in the new year. Today with us is our visiting fellow Bakar Berekašvili, who is a professor of political science and sociology at the Georgian American University and a political analyst at the Georgian Public Broadcast, or First Channel. His research interests include critical sociology, Marxist thought in actually existing socialism, post-socialist politics and society, Soviet Union, problems of democracy, politics of memory in Europe, and many others as well. And today he will talk about a topic we don't hear a lot of in Slovenia, about Marxist thought in Soviet Georgia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nessa, for this introduction. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. So today, as you see, I'll be speaking about Marxist thought in Soviet Georgia. But before I will go particularly speaking about the traditions of the Marxist thought in Soviet Georgia, let me, at the beginning, let me describe generally what I could say about academic and political reception of Marxism in Soviet Union, so that to make, like, let's say, this general picture of what was the major, let's say, trends. There were three principal directions when we are speaking about Marxist thought in Soviet Union and Marxist theory and Marxist teaching, speaking generally. To scientific communism, it is, as you know, it is very important, let's say, fundamental component of the Marxist theory. And the very idea of the scientific communism, both in Marxist theory and also in Soviet Union, was to contribute the communist transformation of society. And it was based on three fundamental principles: the socialist revolution, end of private property, and the dictatorship of proletariat. So the scientific communism represented one of the most important category in Marxist thought in Soviet Union. And the next one was, of course, political economy. According to the Soviet scientific traditions, political economy was considered as a category, as a field of social sciences, which aimed to study the laws of the social reproduction and the distribution of material wealth at various stages of the development of human society. And of course, the dialectical and historical materialism, which is also one of the most important elements of the Marxist thought. And it, of course, it particularly meant like a materialistic and dialectical concept of history, study of society and its history. So these three components of three directions of Marxism determined the agenda of academic and political life in Soviet Union during the entire period. So let's now talk particularly about Marxist experience in Georgia and who were Marxists in Georgia. And particularly, I mean academic and scientific background of the Marxists. They were philosophers, historians, and the political economists. When speaking about philosophers and political economists, they not only were engaged in Marxist philosophical studies or in investigating Marxist political economy, but also the philosophers and political economists in Soviet Georgia also took the role of the sociologists. Because the history of sociology in Soviet Union has quite different experiences. And mostly it flourished after the Second World War, when in Russia there was established the Soviet Sociological Association, and the sociology appeared as a separate discipline. But this was not the case in Georgia. In Georgia, the sociology as a separate discipline arrived in a late Soviet Union, quite late. So, but it does not mean that sociological thinking and sociological works did not occur in Soviet Georgia. It was philosophers and political economists who were also engaged in sociological studies and in sociological thinking. But this is not, of course, a unique case for Soviet Georgia, because back in 20th century, also in Europe, like philosophers and political economists also positioned as a sociological thinkers too. So, and regarding the historians, of course, they had important role in the Marxist cycles because they were mostly engaged in historical study of the communism, of socialism, and what is very important, also historians had a very special role in historical study of the anti-colonialism, neo-colonialism, imperial colonialism, and so on and so forth. So these were mostly like these three categories of the professionals, of the academics were involved in, were considered as a Marxist in Soviet Georgia. So what was the main academic locus where these Marxist scholars gathered and where they did their teaching and their research activities? The first was Tbilisi State University. In 1920s, Tbilisi State University became the major locus of the Marxist academic community in Georgia, and during the entire period of the Soviet Union, Tbilisi State University, and particularly the Faculty of Philosophy and Faculty of History, remained as an important place of Marxist scholars. But also, Tbilisi State University had very strong department of scientific communism. And of course, another academic locus was Georgian Soviet Academy of Sciences. The Georgian Academy of Sciences was one of the most important, I would say, the scientific institution in whole Soviet Union. It was established in 1941 when the war started in Soviet Union, and it during the entire period of Soviet times, the Academy of Sciences was one of the major place of research activities in Georgia, in Soviet Georgia, and the Academy of Sciences maintained different important institutions, research institutions. But when we are speaking about Marxist cycles, there were mostly two institutions where Marxist were engaged in the research activities. It was the Institute of Philosophy, which was very strong in whole Soviet Union, not only in Soviet Georgia. And the Institute of Philosophy had also different departments, but one of the strongest departments was the Department of Historical Materialism. And another institute, which was the locus of the Marxist scholars at the Academy of Sciences, was the Institute of Economics and Law. And the Institute of Economics and Law was also involved in a sociological studies, in a sociological, let's say, they were involved in a sociological theoretical works too, together with, of course, Institute of Philosophy. So these two institutions played important role during development of the Marxist thought in Georgia. Both institutions had teaching and research profile, and again I want to say that the Academy of Sciences represented one of the most important locus of the Marxist thinking, but of course everything started from Tbilisi State University. And then when Academy of Sciences was established, the scholars usually had double affiliations. They were like Georgian Marxist philosophers or political economists. Usually they were affiliated both with Tbilisi State University and Georgian Academy of Sciences. So the first generation of Marxist scholars in Georgia, speaking generally about Marxism, the Marxism has quite long history in contemporary history of Georgia. Already in the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century, the Georgia was one of the most important place of Marxist intellectuals in Russian Empire, and they played an important role in cultural and intellectual life of Russian Empire. And the Marxist revolutionaries also in Georgia, in Soviet Georgia, also played, let's say, important role in whole revolutionary movement in Russian Empire. But when we are speaking, of course, about Soviet scholars, particularly about Soviet scholars, the first generation appeared in Soviet Union in 1920s. It was the first generation, and they started from Tbilisi State University. They were mostly lecturers and professors at Tbilisi State University, young generation of the Marxist scholars. What is important, and I would like to underline, is that the first generation of Marxist scholars not only received education at Tbilisi State University in 1920s, but also they received philosophical and scientific trainings also abroad. Especially Germany was popular in 1920s. and especially Heidelberg and Freiburg. The universities in Heidelberg and Freiburg were major places where Soviet Georgian scholars also received another philosophical training. And then they came back to Soviet Union and they established a very strong school of the philosophy. But of course, not only there was a German, of course, universities, but again, Russian universities, which also played very important role in educating, let's say, Soviet Georgian scholars. The first generation of Soviet Georgian scholars also, when they studied abroad and in Germany, they also actually were writing some publicistic letters and articles and essays, sending it to Soviet Georgia, and these papers and letters or essays were published in local Marxist magazines and journals. This happened in the end of 1920s and in 1920s in general, and also beginning of 1930s. So then there was a post-war generation, which was the generation already as after the Second World War, as you know, and the post-war generation, already differently from the first generation of the Soviet scholars, did not receive any education abroad. I mean, when I say abroad, I mean mostly in Western Europe. Because already after the Second World War in 40s and in 50s, the educational institutions in Soviet Union was very strong, including in Soviet Georgia, it was very strong. And the post-Soviet Marxists also, they were trained and educated in Georgia at Tbilisi State University, and also they also were educated in Moscow State University and other universities of the Soviet Union. So the post-war generation was a particularly Soviet generation, let's say the generation with educational upbringing of the Soviet system. And in post-war Georgia, the scientific life was already very rich, and intellectual life was very rich, and post-war scholars contributed a lot to development of Marxist theory and Marxist thought in entire Soviet Union, and then in entire socialist world, they played an important role. So what were the major themes of scientific critique and investigation in Marxist academic cycles of Soviet Georgia? Critical study of imperialism, capitalism, and bourgeois philosophical theories. The critical study of imperialism also included the critique of ideological forms of imperialism, especially geopolitical, racist, cosmopolitan, Malthusian forms of imperialism. When speaking about cosmopolitan, for example, in Soviet Union, the cosmopolitanism was in contradiction with internationalism, and the cosmopolitanism in Soviet Georgian Marxist thought was considered as a synonym of westernization or Americanization of the post-war world, or capitalism without borders. So when we say like cosmopolitan form of imperialism, it meant the critique of capital without borders. Capitalism without borders. When we are speaking about critical study of capitalism, it not only included the critique of capitalism from the perspectives of Marxist political economy, but also it included a quite big degree of the critique of capitalism from sociocultural perspectives, like greed, individualism, consumerism, egocentrism, and all this type of, let's say, the social pathologies which is accompanied with capitalism. So the critique of capitalism was not only from political economy perspectives, but also from philosophical and sociological perspectives too. And when we're speaking about bourgeois philosophical theories, the critical study of bourgeois philosophical theories mostly meant to show how Western philosophy serves for the interests of capitalism, how Western philosophical theories legitimize and intellectualize the interests of bourgeois class. So it was, for them, it was a sort of class project imposed by academics to legitimize a particular bourgeois project. And they had, and Soviet Georgian Marxist philosophers actually wrote very important books and monographies and works which critically explained the traditions of the bourgeois philosophical thought. Another is the critical Western bourgeois sociology. And when we are speaking about critical Western bourgeois sociology, first of all means the critique of bourgeois sociological thinking and bourgeois sociological methodology. For Soviet scholars, the task of sociology was to help to society to understand the social world, to understand the social problems, and to familiarize with social processes, and to help how to live in a particular time, how to live in a given social world. And for Georgian Soviet scholars and for Soviet scholars in general, the bourgeois sociology did not answer these questions. The bourgeois sociology was not able to help society to understand the social world because it was very important for them because, as you know, in Marxist theory and in Marxist thought, generally the idea of theory is to explain the reality. And this is how theory is different from ideology, because ideology is about false consciousness, and theory and science is about the reality. And so the Soviet scholars believed that the task of sociology was to critically explain the reality, but according to Soviet traditions, the Western bourgeois sociology was not able to help society because they were over-concentrated with methodology. Because as you know, in post-war Europe and in post-war America too, the methods and the techniques occupied the field of sociology, and the methods were more important, let's say, for thinking, and more important to concentrate than theory and then other, let's say, approaches or strategies. So the Soviet Georgian Marxist scholars blamed Western bourgeois sociology that they research methods for methods and they don't use methods in order to explain, in order to identify the problems of capitalism. Of course, this does not mean that Soviet Georgian scholars rejected the idea of methods in sociology, definitely no. But what they tried to say is that it is important that method should not exist as an empty signifier, but method should be used in order to identify, in order to find the basic problems of the capitalist societies, which Western bourgeois society, according to them, was reluctant to do that. The critique of Western Marxism and the critical study of anti-communism and bourgeois sociology was another the topic of scientific critique and investigation of Soviet Georgian cycles. The critical Western Marxism, I'll be speaking soon about it, particularly what they mean. But of course, the critical Western Marxism first of all meant critique of revisionism and social democracy, definitely. And they were also engaged in a very comprehensive study of anti-communism and bourgeois ideology. Particularly, they were interested how bourgeois ideology provokes anti-communism. They were critically analyzing the different scientific works written in 1950s and 60s, the scientific works popular in the field of so-called the end of ideology. For example, Georgian Soviet scholars developed several important critical thoughts about Daniel Bell's famous thesis of the end of ideology, and this critique was very valuable and quite, let's say, strongly argued. The critique, because when Daniel Bell argued that there is an end of ideology in post-war West because he meant, first of all, about the end of ideology, the clash between classic ideologies, the Soviet scholars did not agree with this because they considered that the end of ideology must not be considered only from the clash of standpoints, but it must be considered about clash of different social orders. And since there exists socialist order, and since there is a capitalist order, there will be always this. There will be always ideological conflict, and the speaking about the end of ideology, they considered as a propaganda. But also when they criticized Daniel Bell and other authors, they also, the Soviet scholars also observed that while Western scholars are speaking about the end of ideology, at the same time in West, in 1950s and 60s, there was a very strong ideological, let's say, mechanisms and cultural ideological apparatus to fight against the Soviet Union and to fight against communism. So while Western academics were speaking about the end of ideology, Soviet scholars were trying to show different, let's say, story and different approach about the so-called end of ideology. There was ethical and moral foundations of communism and study of socialism and historical materialism. Ethical and moral foundations of communism means that there were philosophical works written how to contribute to development of communist society. What does it mean to have a good communist society? What does it mean to be a good socialist or good communist citizen? So it was about pedagogical and social upbringing of the communist citizen in Soviet times. And the study of socialism particularly meant not only study of the history of socialism, not only study of historical and materialist and dialectical materialism, but also the study of socialism included the investigation of the cultural, economic, and the political aspects of the developed socialism, how the culture, economy, and politics functioned in so-called developed or in real socialism. And this was quite important work because it was speaking about ethical and moral foundations of the communism. It was in a political line of the Soviet system. So this, of course, the field was quite promoted. Another topic was Marxism and Marxist methodology, and works about Marx and Engels. Actually, Soviet Georgian scholars did lots of works in this direction, and works about works of Engels and Marx, and works about Marxist methodology, how to use Marxist methodology. For example, Marxist methodological application to criticize capitalism, imperialism, and so on and so forth. And the works written by Georgian Soviet scholars were actually quite popular abroad. They were translated in French and in Chinese languages. Also, not to say about Russian and Eastern European languages. Also, some works were also translated. And critique of imperial colonialism and neocolonialism and study of anti-colonialism. As I mentioned before, the historians especially were assigned with this task to research the problems of neocolonialism and also to research the process of anti-colonialism. As you know, after the Second World War, in this big wave of decolonization, Soviet Union played important role in the process of decolonization. And of course, Soviet scholars were also engaged in this process of the promotion of anti-colonialism and decolonization from the academic perspectives. And Soviet Georgian scholars had also a very special role to show the history of the colonial imperialism, about oppressive nature of colonial imperialism, and at the same time to show what was happening in 1950s and 60s and 70s in former colonies of the Western colonial empires. I mentioned that there was the critical study of the Marxists, Western Marxists, and Soviet Marxists were against revisionists. They used this word, right-wing socialists. And they considered the Western Marxists as the right-wing socialists because, according to them, Western Marxists declined the idea of socialist revolution and the revolutionary destruction of capitalism. And also Western Marxists rejected the idea of the dictatorship of proletariat and the end of the private property. So since revisionism, for example, or European socialism, was in disagreement with these postulates of the revolutionary Marxism, they considered Western Marxists as a so-called right-wing socialists. And they considered reformed capitalism or reformist socialism, socialism without Marx, or socialism without revolution. And because you know that in 20th century in intellectual life of Europe and in America also, the scholars who also considered to be the Marxists, they also supported the idea of the so-called automatic destruction of the capitalism, so that capitalism will end naturally. And like, for example, that Josef Schumpeter, which was also like arguing about the inevitable end of collapse of capitalism. Soviet Marxists were against this principle because, and they were correct in this, because Marx never considered so-called automatic end of capitalism, but he considered revolution as an important mechanism to end the capitalism. And you know his famous word that the revolutions are the locomotive of history. So based on this very classic Marxist definition, or based on this very classic Marxist concept, Soviet Georgian Marxists considered Western Marxists as a reactionary intellectual force against revolutionary Marxism. And they included in this reactionary force Frankfurt School, and they considered Frankfurt School as an anti-communist, as a cycle of anti-communist leftists or left intellectuals. And they especially disagreed with Frankfurt schools like with methods and theoretical thinkings, and especially misinterpretation of the Marxist theory. And they considered praxis as they called it conceptual relative of the Frankfurt school, that they like imitated or simulated with processes. They blamed also praxis schools that they collaborate with revisionists, and they have this lots of big degree of revisionist views and so on and so forth. So and sociological, philosophical, and political economist works written by Soviet scholars criticizing the Western Marxism also shows very big degree of erudition of the Marxist thought, fundamental knowledge of the Marxist thought. That in these polemics against Western Marxism, they used the classical, theoretical, and methodological approaches of Marxism. I would like to say something also about international scientific interventions. The Soviet Georgian scholars also had quite successful presence in international academic arena. Among them was quite very just few of such events are given here, especially the World Congress of Sociology in Milano and Stresa in autumn of 1959, and the World Congress of Sociology in Washington in the autumn of 1962. And in this Congress, actually, in the World Congress of Sociology in Washington, Soviet Georgian philosopher Vladimir Shchenieradze was his name. He presented a very strong critique of the Walt Rostow's theory of the stage of the economic growth. The Walt Rostow was a famous, as you know, anti-communist American scholar, and he and Georgian Soviet scholar presented a very strong paper, and he practically destroyed on this anti-communist theory of the Walt Rostow. And actually, that Soviet philosopher, as I said, Vladimir Shchenieradze, he was also very big name also in Soviet Union. He was vice president of the Academy of Sciences. For a while, he also worked in Paris in UNESCO in 1970s as a head of the social science department. And there was also a World Congress of Sociology in Varna in Bulgaria in summer of 1917. But there was also very successful representation in World Congresses of Philosophy, especially in Vienna. The Georgian philosophers had very strong representation, successful representation in 1968. So World Congress of Philosophy in Montreal, which was opened the keynote and the closing remarks was given by Vladimir Šenieradze, the philosopher who criticized the Rostov's theory. In Montreal, he made the opening and closing remarks of the World Congress. And there was in Brighton, also in England, which was also another event of where Georgian Soviet scholars had successful participation. So why Soviet Georgian Marxist thought matter today? I mean, because when Soviet Union collapsed in already formally in 1991, of course, all kind of Marxist thought, Marxist literature and Marxist traditions were neglected and forgotten in academic and, of course, in political life, certainly, of Georgia, because in 1990s, Georgia moved to this direction of the neoliberal transformation and new capitalist order. And under this new neoliberal era, of course, the Soviet Georgian scholars became so-called authors of forgotten pantheon. That their names and their works was not interesting for neoliberal capitalists. But whatever neoliberal capitalist thinks, the thought of Soviet Georgian Marxism is after 30 years of the neoliberal transformation, not only in Georgia, but in all over the world, because the pathologies of neoliberalism was expanded not only in post-Soviet world, but in all around the world after the end of the Cold War. The crisis of capitalism, and especially what Soviet Georgian scholars speaking about, that capitalism produces a big degree of inequality and social injustice, and the crisis of and of course they use this classical Marxist theory that capitalism is in constant crisis. That crisis is a like eternal accompanying element of the crisis. This is now what also we experience in post-socialist, post-Soviet world, because the neoliberal transformation brought new social pathologies, because the Soviet Georgia was one of the most flourished and most developed country in the Soviet Union. We had the most successful economic development and the most successful scientific and technological also achievements. And after Soviet Union, all this collapsed. And unfortunately, in post-Soviet world, not only in Georgia but in any other societies, the people expected from capitalism that it was like in Hollywood movies, that everything will be so good that we will all live in the paradise of capitalism. But unfortunately, what people forgot is that even in Hollywood movies, there is never always happy end. Yes, in Hollywood movies also there are lots of the pathologies of. We can also see the pathological trends of capitalism. But unfortunately, in post-Soviet space, the capitalism arrived as a project of Americanization, Westernization as a cosmopolitan project, which of course disintegrated the Georgian society. And not only disintegrated, but it also provoked various forms of structural violence. And in the end, it also made problems with the national sovereignty, because the neoliberal capital, the influence of neoliberal capitalism and transnational corporations and the international neoliberal financial corporations have very strong influence over the economic agenda of the post-Soviet Georgia. And so the crisis of capitalism means that as Soviet Georgian scholars were arguing, that they argued that communism is better than capitalism, because in capitalism we face particular problems. What they were arguing in 1950s, the Georgians saw everything this since 1990s till now. And the crisis of liberal universalism, or Soviet Georgian scholars never believed in liberal universal internationalist order, and they believed only in a communist international order, because they believed that liberal universalism is not an answer for the global challenges, that liberal universalism cannot solve the cultural, economic and social problems, but it can only fuel this problem. It can only enlarge this problem. And we see also today the crisis of the liberal universalists, the crisis of West. The crisis of West was also quite important topic for Georgian Marxist cycles because they considered West as a cultural zone which is always in search of its meaning, but at the same time it is controlled by bourgeois cultural apparatus and bourgeois economic apparatus. And now we see the crisis of West that when we speak about crisis of capitalism and crisis of liberal universalism, it of course means at the same time crisis of West. And no end of history, but history and laws of history continue to evolve. You know that in 1992, when Soviet Union collapsed, it was newly collapsed, the Francis Fukuyama presented his famous work about the end of history, that liberal democracy and Western liberal civilization is a triumphal project, and so there is the end of history. And of course, this is not true because the history continues to exist. As much as human society exists, history will continue to exist and it will not disappear. And not only it continues to exist, but history also. But the problem of Fukuyama is that liberal democracy, which is now mutated into neoliberal democracy, became another topic of scientific investigation and intellectual critique. And it means that history always repeats itself, and that the end of Soviet Union did not mean the end of communism and socialism. It meant the finish of particular historical phase, but not whole history. Because as we see that today's crisis of capitalism and today's crisis of the ideology, of the capitalist ideology and of the neoliberal crisis of neoliberal state, again shows that history continues to exist and that there is this struggle, there is this resistance, and there is not a global universal project which has a global reception in all over the world. But there are still the societies and nations which are, let's say, which are suffering with existing new type of imperialism and with existing neoliberal capitalism. So this was, I hope I did not exceed my time. Yes, and this was mostly I wanted to say about Marxist thought in Soviet Georgia, what were the major trends and why it matters. Today there are many details and nuances to be talked, but for now we can stop here, and if you have questions and or comments, I would be happy to answer. Thank you.
So the audience on Zoom is invited to ask the questions in the chat, while the audience here in the room is of course invited to ask them immediately. So if you have any questions right now, if not, I can start.
Yes, please.
So my question is, you mentioned praxis already, but I'm curious if you ever encountered either a critique or any thoughts on the general Yugoslav system, so the self-management system and the way Yugoslav socialism went.
Yes, the political economists especially were interested in critique of Yugoslav model, and of course the critique of Yugoslav model was that of course the Soviet Georgian scholars considered the Soviet system as the best system, and they considered Yugoslav model as something which is approximated with a revisionist model. It is different, of course, with revisionist model, but it is more far away with Soviet model and near with revisionist model. So when they were critical about Yugoslav model, they of course they considered Yugoslav model as a sort of attempt to replicate Western Marxism and as an attempt to distance from the Soviet system, while Soviet scholars considered Soviet system as the real reflection of the communism.
Okay. Any more questions? Maya?
Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. I have a question about different relations of Soviet Georgian scholars, Marxist scholars, firstly to the political authorities, both in Georgia and Soviet Union, Then about different generations of scholars, like what was the thought evolving, because from what you told us, and I knew that it was very general, so it wasn't the pinpoint of your talk, so was this thought evolving, conflicting, like, and so on? And then I'm interested in relations between Georgian Marxists and Soviet Marxists.
Yeah.
Was this also like a conflicting relationship or symbiotic relationship? So what was, I'm interested in those dynamics.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Regarding the political authority, the Soviet, the Soviet academia believed that they need to support the communist transformation of society, and they believed that the Soviet authority was the one who is also in this line. And of course, there was certainly and unsurprisingly, there was not any conflict between political authority and the Marxist scholars. But not only because, of course, before the Second World War, some of the Marxist scholars were also under repressions. But after the Second World War, the harmony between the Soviet Marxist scholars in Georgian political authority was not because of fear or because of threats, but because they considered that they are both in same political and rhetorical line. And this is like struggle against capitalism and promotion of the Marxists. But also what is very important is that differently from West, what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to say that in West the scholars did not enjoy reputations. They did. But the Soviet scholars had bigger authority and reputation, even in political arena, than it was or for example, sociologists or philosophers in West, in post-war Europe, for example. The Soviet scholars had very big, they were like big names in culture, in society, and like professors and the members of Academy of Sciences were more respected individuals in societies than even ministers. And this big intellectual authority, of course, helped them that it was not easy, let's say, that for political authority to have conflict with them. But also, as I say, there was no reason of conflict because they were in same political line. But also regarding the relations, yes, actually, there was no any clash. I mean, I could not find when I read and when I research this topic, I could not find that there was some, let's say, confrontation between, for example, cycles of philosophers or political economists or historians, but definitely what was that they had their own academic cycles, that they have their everyday life sociology, let's say. They had their institutions, they had their locus of gathering, their team of friends, let's say, or comrades. Yes, I mean, we cannot say that like philosophers, economists, and historians, they were like one cycle. Of course, they were different cycles, but the cycle which is composing, let's say, the Marxist community. So, and regarding the relationship with Soviet Marxists, also it was not certainly conflictive, but the Soviet Marxists, for example, the Marxists in Russia, for example, of course, they had. There were certain, let's say, traditions of the philosophical investigations which was more popular in Georgia than in Russia, for example. And so the Russian scholars also learned a lot from Georgian scholars. So there was not a conflict, but there was sort of intellectual exchange. And sometimes, like, let's say, intellectual, the guidelines also written by Soviet Georgian scholars. But of course, when we are speaking about representation of the Soviet scholars in international scientific arena, of course, the representation from Moscow was bigger than representation from Tbilisi. But this is because in Moscow it was bigger Academy of Sciences with bigger ambitions. But it does not mean that Soviet Georgian scholars did not have their say. They had their important say during these international events. and also they, the Soviet Georgian scholars with other Soviet scholars, they worked for collaborative projects. They were writing together books about scientific communism. So in Soviet Georgia, the relation among the intellectuals was quite homogenic. It was not like in West that there are some the conflictive groups and the critic sometimes excels with personal clash. Such experience Soviet academia rarely had. Of course, there was a competition. Competition in terms of course, there were the philosophers and political economists with bigger names, but it never created the source of the conflict with other authors who did not enjoy such big reputation or authority, let's say.
Just a couple
Just a couple of questions that I think are maybe in a way repetition of what I said, but I'm wondering also about other perspectives. First is that now you talked about the relationship between Georgian and like Moscow Soviet thinkers, for instance, but is there a possibility like what would happen if you would compare with other Soviet contexts that were not central? So this is one thing that I'm interested in, and then I'm wondering whether there were also some revisionist thinkers in Georgia as well, and whether there was some sort of discussion there, and were there any women there?
Yeah, sure. The first question was about other Soviet republics, let's say. Yes, I'm mostly concentrated on Soviet Georgia and generally also about Soviet Union, but. Of course, there were, let's say, the scientific collaboration with other Soviet republics, definitely. But if we observe the Marxist thought in Soviet Union, Soviet Georgian scholars always took quite, let's say, dominant positions in this intellectual life, let's say. But of course, there was also quite strong, let's say, intellectual moments also in other Soviet republics. But Georgian scholars played important roles than other scholars, I would say. However, it does not mean that other scholars also did not have their place, of course. But mostly, as I observed, the Soviet, let's say, Soviet Georgia, the role of Soviet Georgians, I can say about Soviet Georgians that it was quite. And when you even observe the participation, international scientific representation, like Georgian scholars are more, let's say, represented there than other Soviet republics. But again, in other Soviet republics also they had good philosophical schools, also studying like different problems of philosophy. But regarding the revision, no. The answer is no. I mean, there was no any revisionist in Georgian Soviet Marxist scholar cycles. The revisionism was considered as a part of bourgeois ideology. And regarding the women, yes, there were. Some of them were showed even in the presentation. But also there was also very famous woman. The very famous woman. She was very, let's say, she was even bigger name than many others, let's say, and she was a specialist she was a philosopher, and she was a specialist of the Marxist philosophy and also European philosophical traditions. And she enjoyed quite big reputation in the Academy of Science, and Mary Chelidze was her name. But also there were other women also who, especially working in the field of literature, Marxist literature theory, for example, literature theory and the Marxist direction, let's say. But of course, if we compare the numbers, of course, the male representatives of Marxist scholars it was large numbers than female, but the female scholars and women scholars had their important role in the intellectual life of the Soviet Georgia. generally women had very strong also representation in political life also in Soviet Georgia. There were women members of Supreme Council. Supreme Council is same as the parliament. In Soviet time it was called Supreme Council. Also women in Soviet Georgia took the position of the deputy secretary of the party, which is like deputy prime minister, for example, central committee, the deputy secretary. So they were the women involved in scientific life.
Okay. Anna?
Yeah, following up on Maya's and Isidora's, I have a two-part question, but a little bit of a background first for the audience, because you obviously know it. On the 25th of February in 1956, Khrushchev, during the 20th Communist Party Congress, famously said that it is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person and ascribe supernatural features to him and treat him like a god, which launched the famous process of de-Stalinization. So now comes the two-part question. How did the Georgian scholars of that time receive that process in the 50s, but also later during the second half of the 20th century, given the fact that Stalin, whose real name was Berekašvili, came from Georgia? And how do contemporary Georgian scholars treat a current resentment about Stalin, because reportedly there are more than 10 monuments to Stalin which have been erected in the recent years in contemporary Georgia, and given this latest scandal about the icon depicting also Stalin in central Tbilisi churches, I believe it is controlled by the Russian Orthodoxy, but I'm not sure, you will correct me there, but this scandal is widely reported in the media.
Okay, so regarding the Khrushchev speech, the Georgians...
Stalinization,
the Georgians were very angry when Khrushchev made this speech, because the Georgians not only, in Khrushchev's speech, Georgians not only saw the Khrushchev's hate against Stalin, but also they read in this speech, they understand from Khrushchev's speech as a hate speech against Georgians. And this mobilized lots of Georgians in 1956. There was a big demonstration against Khrushchev. And until now, Georgians believe that Khrushchev had xenophobic, let's say, views and hate against Georgians. And in a way, Khrushchev was really aggressive when he was speaking about Georgians, and that's true. But also, what happened after in this de-Stalinization period, of course, the writers and the authors and the scientists certainly changed a little bit their, let's say, their way of writing. But I would not say that in Georgia there was a fundamental change of their philosophical and social thinking after Stalinism. Of course, some books were published with new edition, and some books were like revised, but it never questioned the fundamental issues. So after Stalinism, I would not say that the Georgian Soviet scholars wrote texts and books or papers to amuse Khrushchev and to attack Stalin. There was no such cases. I mean, but of course, some books were published as a revised edition, not only during Khrushchev but also during Brezhnev's period. Yes. So. And because when Georgian Soviet scholars were citing, for example, Stalin during Stalin's period, they were citing the scientific works of Stalin, which was valuable always during the entire Soviet period. For example, Marxism and National Question, and other, let's say, essays and other works of Stalin about historical and dialectical materialism. So when they cited Stalin, they did not cite Stalin in Stalin's period. Not only, it was not just propaganda, it was also, let's say, a scientific application of the Stalin's views. Regarding today, I don't know. I mean, today Georgian society is polarized about Stalin. For many, Stalin is an important name because of his particular role in the Second World War. And for many, the Stalin is a dictator and tyranny and so on. But I can give you ideological explanation of this. The neoliberals, the admirers of free market economy, the admirers of the supremacy of the West, of course they are against Stalin. But ordinary Georgian citizens who, let's say, who are not under the ideological influence of the post-Soviet politics, they are either neutral or they consider Stalin as an important historical figure. I mean, it is the topic of Stalin is always the ideological topic in Georgia. Even anti-Stalinists at the same time are not anti-Stalinists in Georgia. If you see anti-Stalinist liberal, he's or she's also against socialism, against communism, even against social democracy, even against revisionism. If you observe like urban liberal intellectuals in post-Soviet Georgia, their anti-Stalinism is not just anti-Stalinism, but their anti-Stalinism goes against any ideological categories than liberal democracy or neoliberalism. So this is like ideological. This is a topic of ideological struggle, and if we continue to talk about this, we will need lots of time because it is completely another topic.
So Stalin is discussed only in terms of ideology and not in terms of crimes against humanity, genocides. That is not a topic for Georgian intellectuals.
No, it is. Yeah, it is discussed also by, for example, pro-Western liberal scholars, but it is the discussion is scientifically really poor because any discussion, any discourses regarding the repressive apparatus of Stalin is scientifically proved by the speech of Khrushchev. There is no, and there is mostly like Khrushchev's speech, which they use as evidence of the Stalin's repressive apparatus, and they also use British and American anti-communist scholars who were writing about Stalin. And, it is very polemical, because the anti-communist scholars writing about Stalin had their own ideological agenda. And if we are speaking about like objective investigation of Stalinism in Georgia, there is no such. And there is no even objective scientific study of Soviet Union. When in Georgia today, if someone of some institution studies Soviet Union, it is a study of Soviet Union as a communist monster. But there is nothing about like industrialization, about urbanization, modernization, and about like other stories of the Soviet system. And these scientific studies are not also methodologically grounded from scientifically strong arguments, let's say. They are mostly like folklore talks and like I don't know, some imaginary talks when people are speaking about Soviet Union. And people, when scholars are speaking. For example, we have now rising trend of nostalgia in Soviet Georgia, in post-Soviet Georgia, to Soviet nostalgia we have. And the liberal intellectuals or right-wing intellectuals, when they explain the reasons of nostalgia, they say that this is a consequence of Russian propaganda. But this is not scientifically proved. This is not true. Because there are many other sociological studies conducted in Eastern European countries which also face the communist nostalgia. And scientific studies show that the communist nostalgia is sourced from the disappointment of capitalism. That in 1990s people lost their job, their social status, that capitalism brought new problems, and the nostalgia and the communist nostalgia became higher. The Russian propaganda has nothing to do with communist nostalgia in post-Soviet world, because today's Russia is not a communist Russia. It has nothing to do with communist nostalgia.
Okay, does anyone have another question?
Yeah, I have a question about the accessibility of the texts and critiques you mentioned. Are any of these works translated, specifically the critiques of the bourgeois ideology in the Frankfurt School? I assume this was written in Georgian or in Russian. Was it translated into English or German or any other European
Serbian.
As far as I know, but it needs more research, of course, more findings are needed. When we are speaking about the clash with Western Marxism, the books are in Georgian, only in Russian. But the other books, for example, which is in the field of the problems of dialectics in German philosophy, for example, or the problems of socialism, or the philosophical reflections of Karl Marx, such books are translated in other languages, but rarely in English. Mostly they are translated in French and in Chinese and in Eastern European languages. But regarding the conflict with Western Marxism and with Praxis School, the sources are available only in Georgian and Russian. Yeah.
I just have two very quick questions that are totally not connected between each other. First thing to say. One is, did the reception of Marxism change in the 90s? So after transition, after Soviet Union fell apart, because of course we know that systems changed and universities changed as well. And the other one is actually piggybacking of your answer to Isidora's last question. Were there any separate women's organizations in Soviet Georgia? So those two.
Yeah, okay.
As I said, not connected at all.
So Marxism after Soviet Union, the reception of Marxism after Soviet Union. As I said,
early 90s, exactly after transition.
It was under attack. Mm-hmm. The Marxism was under attack, and even there was lots of, let's say, facts of barbarism. I would say that in universities in Georgia, the lots of Marxist literature were taken from the department, and it was simply thrown out. And the Marxism practically was announced as a, let's say, as a useless scientific category, which is the biggest mistake and catastrophe of the post-Soviet Georgian academia, because studying sociology, political science, philosophy, history without using the theories and the works of Marx is very difficult process, and we have a very big crisis of intellectual life in Georgia, and this crisis of intellectual life in Georgia mirrors the general cultural crisis of the post-Soviet Georgia, and unfortunately in the early 90s Marxism was completely forgotten. But then the new generations come who were born under capitalism, and they saw that capitalism gave for them practically nothing. And now, like students and new generation, they have more interest in Soviet, not only in Marxism, but even in Soviet history, to look from different perspectives of socialism, of the history of socialism, and the history of the Soviet Union. And now, I cannot say that Marxism is widely received in Georgian academic space, but certainly it is more promoted. Because I can tell you, when I was a student 20 years ago, there were only few students at my university, at Tbilisi State University, which were considered then socialists. And now there are many students who have this left-wing, let's say, critical stance about capitalism and about post-Soviet capitalism. But of course, now we have this also in Georgia, among the young generation. Western Marxism is also popular, and this is another now problem that some, let's say, some are taking the side of Western Marxism, some take the side of the Soviet Marxism. But the Marxist thought came back in cultural and in social life because of exactly the crisis which we witnessed after the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War. The crisis brings this, let's say, historical, let's say, ideas back. And regarding the women, as I know, there were certain like women clubs and women, let's say, cycles of of the intellectuals, of the cultural elites, but I'm not sure that there was a separate women club of Soviet Marxist scholars. This, okay. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you. So, any more questions? If not, I suggest we end this lecture. Thank you for coming to us to talk to us. Thank you everyone in the audience for attending. And before I invite you for coffee, I would just like to invite everyone to the lecture, to the History on the Edge next month. So on February the 14th, you are invited to listen to the lecture by Maya Lorbeck on New Schools for New Education, so the international exchanges of school building in the post-war Europe. And now coffee and cookies are behind there, and see you next month.
Thank you very much.